Hi there, students. Welcome back. We're going to talk about Chapter 5, Part 2. We are still in the American Revolution. So let's get started. All right, so here are key terms for this lecture. We're going to begin with the Second Continental Congress, which essentially serves as the governing body for the colonies during the entire Revolutionary period. And then we're going to talk about some of the battles. We're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence in this particular lecture. This is a really key, important thing to understand about the philosophical underpinnings of the revolutionary movement. And then we're going to talk about some of um, the colonists who are making up the voluntary army and the loyalists who are remaining loyal to the British Crown. Okay, so we left off in our last lecture talking about Lexington and Concord, which was essentially the first battle of the Revolutionary War. And in response to Lexington and Concord, a Second Continental Congress is convened, and this happens in May of 1775. So Lexington and Concord happens in April of 1775, and in May of 1775, delegates are again called to come to Philadelphia to decide how to respond to what is perceived British aggression. And there was a lot of disagreement amongst the delegates about whether or not to break from England, from Britain. But there was no disagreement that Massachusetts colony needed to be defended. And there was a very strong sense that the military presence, the British military presence in Massachusetts had really gotten out of control and had overstepped their boundaries. So there is an army that is essentially is created with George Washington put in charge of that army as basically the commander in chief of that army. And he was a good fit. He was somebody who was respected. He was seen as somebody who had a sort of moderate temperament. And he also had military experience because he had fought in the French and Indian War. They also, the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775, drafted a declaration on the causes and necessities of taking up arms. So one thing you have to know about the British is they're very fond of their declarations, right? And essentially what a declaration is it's a written statement that says it justifies your actions, right? It justifies why you are doing something. And so they felt compelled to justify the reasons why they felt that they needed to take up arms against the British Empire. Okay. And then the other thing that they did at this first meeting is they issued $2 million. They authorized the printing, essentially, of $2 million that was not backed by any gold or silver. So this was just the printing of currency, and these are called continental dollars. And we're going to talk about sort of the financial crisis that this puts the new nation in once the new nation is founded after the war. In just 2 months after they convened in May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress had taken on the major functions of a legitimate government, both militarily and financially, without any legal basis for its authority. So it's just basically taking charge and saying, okay, this is how we're going to move forward. Okay, so interestingly, the Battle of Bunker Hill, as it comes to be known, in June of 1775 is one of the first major battles of the Revolutionary War, and it is also one of the bloodiest battles of the war. So we have for the British the military governor Thomas Gage, who of course was stationed in Boston. He was the one that had ordered the British troops to go out into the countryside and essentially instigated the Lexington and Concord event. And he will be joined by three British generals that are sent from England: William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton. And we're going to hear about these British generals throughout the Revolutionary War period. So there is a peninsula that sticks out very close to the city of Boston called the Charleston Peninsula, and that's where Bunker Hill is located. It's a very strategic location because of its proximity to the city. It allows for example, for safe passage into the Boston Harbor, etc. So even though this is called the Battle of Bunker Hill, the actual fighting of the battle takes place on Breed's Hill. And both of them are right next to each other on this Charleston peninsula. So the British, of course, they have this big naval presence. So they begin the battle by firing from the shoreline, right, off of the boats. And they're essentially attacking the town that is located on the shoreline of this Charleston peninsula. And once they've, basically set the town on fire, they disembark from the boats and they line up in, very sort of formal military fashion, as you see here in this artist rendering of this battle. And, you've got the drummer boys who are drumming out military commands, and you've got the British soldiers all lined up. Now, the story of Bunker Hill is kind of an interesting one because it becomes really legendary because the Americans held their ground against this massive British force. They were led by a colonel by the name of William Prescott, and he essentially was ordering his soldiers who were stationed up at the top of the hill to hold their ground. Meanwhile, the British soldiers down at the bottom really didn't take the American soldiers seriously at all. And the American soldiers actually had been held up in their position for several days, and they were running low on rations, etc. So they were kind of miserable, they were hungry. The British soldiers, on the other hand, they had all these rations and everything. So the story goes that the British soldiers, before they began their ascent up the hill, this first line of soldiers took out their rations and ate in front of the American soldiers and kind of taunted them and said to them, "Oh, I bet you wish you had some of these kibbles," and they're, taunting them and getting the Americans really pissed off. William Prescott says to the Americans, don't fire until you can see the whites of their eyes. And this was a very good advice because keep in mind that the weapons back then, we're talking muskets, are not very accurate. They kind of spray out everywhere and they don't have a very far range. So because the Americans were trying to conserve their munitions, Prescott says to them, just wait. And the Americans, by the time the British get to the top of the hill, the Americans are so infuriated that they just open fire on them. And so when this happens, of course, many of the British soldiers will fall. But ultimately, column after column of British soldiers continue to advance up the hill, and ultimately the Americans will be forced to retreat. However, the British, so this is considered a British victory because the Americans had to retreat. But in terms of a casualty count, and keep in mind when we're talking about war and we're talking about casualties, we're talking about deaths and injuries. The casualty count for the British was much higher than the Americans. We're talking over 1,000 casualties for the British compared to just over 400 for the Americans. So the British force the Americans to retreat. They do retreat, and then they go back to Boston. However, in Boston, there is continued rebellion in the streets, and there's also a smallpox outbreak that happens there, which will essentially force the British soldiers to ultimately retreat out of Boston over to New York, to Manhattan and Long Island, which will essentially become the British headquarters throughout the remainder of the Revolutionary War. So here you see a map, and this gives you an overview of these battlegrounds. So you see here is Breed's Hill, and this is Bunker Hill. And so this is where the Americans were holding their ground initially with that first column. And then they were forced to retreat to Bunker Hill, where there was some more fighting, and then ultimately they were forced to retreat down the neck of the peninsula. So you'll notice here's Charlestown. That's the town that was attacked by the British Navy ships. And then you see over here is Boston. So you can see why the British wanted to kick the American presence out of this peninsula because of its proximity to Boston. Ultimately, it doesn't end up mattering because the British will retreat from Boston, and in a large part due to that smallpox outbreak. So here you see an image of the Charlestown, and you can see here how the British ships are attacking. And then you can just see a different perspective here on Breed's Hill, with the British columns here in red and the American columns here in blue. Probably not, it's doubtful that their uniforms were all uniform like they are showing here in this image. This is very early on in the war where, a lot of people are just simply wearing their normal clothes, but volunteering for the patriot cause. Okay, so meanwhile, of course, the Second Continental Congress continues to convene in Philadelphia, and there starts to be talk of sending what was called an olive branch petition to the king, and especially people from the middle colonies. So people from New Jersey, from New York, from Pennsylvania, they were very hesitant to really see this war through, and they wanted to put an end to the conflict as soon as possible. And so this olive branch petition is created. One of the main creators of this petition is a man by the name of John Dickinson, who from the very beginning had been very reluctant to separate from the British Empire. So he kind of sees where this is going, right? And he doesn't want that to happen. So he pens this olive branch petition. It's written directly to the King of England at the time, King George III. And basically, the king rejects the petition. In the petition, John Dickinson argues that it is the Parliament that is the problem, right? And that many of the American colonists still remain loyal to the crown. So he tries that tactic. Well, as I said, it doesn't work. The king rejects this and declares that the colonies are in full-scale rebellion, and he goes so far as to even call the American traitors. So this is really sort of the last-ditch effort on behalf of the colonists, the last formal effort on behalf of the colonists to try to come to a peaceful resolution to this conflict. All right, so now we're going to talk about the argument for independence. So, people had been talking about this idea since the very beginning. I mean, even really going all the way back to the Stamp Act and all of the protests that were surrounding the Stamp Act. But it won't be until a man by the name of Thomas Paine pens a pamphlet called Common Sense that gets circulated throughout the colonies beginning in January 1776, that this becomes a very popular idea. So Thomas Paine was somebody who was from a very poor family in England, and he moves to London where he is exposed to a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment through his escapades through London coffee shops. And he becomes a very well-known coffee shop intellectual in London. And he, is moving around trying to make a living. In his travels throughout London in the coffee shop scene, he managed to come across Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin writes him what we would like a letter of recommendation. So back in this time period, obviously there's no computer databases. You couldn't look up somebody's name on Google. You couldn't, you had to essentially trust somebody, based on your impression of them, or if that person carried with them letters of recommendation from notable people, they could get far that way. And so Benjamin Franklin was very much impressed by Thomas Paine when he met him in London, and he wrote him one of these letters of recommendation, essentially vouching for his character. And so Thomas Paine, with this letter in hand, moves to the American colonies in December of 1774, and he becomes an editor in Philadelphia, and an editor of a magazine there. And, he's often been referred to as somebody who was a genius, whose genius was very much fueled by brandy. Some of the founding fathers found him very uncouth. Some of, John Adams, for example, didn't think very much of Thomas Paine. But Thomas Paine had a way with writing, and he had a way with writing to the common people. He uses in this pamphlet, Common Sense, some very just sort of plain language. He's not trying to write in any kind of haughty way in which people wouldn't understand. He uses very plain language. He questions the authority of the king directly. Somewhere in the pamphlet, he even goes so far as to call the king an ass, which of course people thought was just hilarious back then. So this pamphlet, as it circulates throughout the colonies, and 150,000 of these pamphlets were circulating throughout the colonies at the beginning of 1776. People are reading it, they're hearing it read out loud, and they're thinking, this actually makes sense. This might actually be possible, right? To break away from England, to have a sense of independence, to create our own country. And for many of the American colonists, you're talking about colonists that are now multiple generation colonists, right? They had already sort of identified as Americans more than Englishmen. And so he's really tuning in to that. He also writes some other very influential tracks. One of them is called The American Crisis, and this is a series of articles that was written during the Revolutionary War in an effort to inspire people to support the war effort, in an effort to inspire the troops. And in fact, George Washington even reads out loud a piece of the American Crisis before the Battle of Trenton, before the crossing of the Delaware. So very, very influential Thomas Paine is in promoting this idea of independence. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence is one of the most influential documents, not just in American history, but in world history. It was written in 1776. And one of the reasons why it was agreed upon to write this document in the Second Continental Congress is that France had promised to help the colonists if they separated from England. So there was kind of this empty promise from France. They hadn't really done much to support the American Revolution up until that point, except for individuals. Some individuals had volunteered and helped and sent money. But as far as a government policy, the government wasn't going to step up and send military support or anything until the colonists made a decision to separate from England. So that was one of the big reasons, the big motivating factors behind this. So a committee is formed to draft a document known as the Committee of Five. Thomas Jefferson is credited with being the primary author of the document, but the four other people on the Committee of Five was John Adams, Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, and Robert Livingston. So there are other folks out there that don't get credit for having been a part of this very famous document, but they should at least get a little shout out. So the document itself invokes the ideals of the Enlightenment. I posted in the Canvas module for this week a copy of the document. And you will, I think, once you read it, appreciate really sort of the progressiveness of the document for the time period. After the preamble of the document, the first paragraph of the document says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And it goes on to say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Those words, those two paragraphs in and of themselves are so powerful and revolutionary for the time period that they influenced, of course, not just the American colonists, the enslaved people in the American colonies, but people all over the world, right? These are the fundamental principles that will guide through not just the American Revolution, but they will also inspire the French Revolution. They will inspire the Haitian Revolution. They will inspire future revolutions for independence. So there is a lot to this document. It is a very, very powerful document. And in order for the document to be approved, it did get voted on by the Second Continental Congress. And it eventually, as the delegates start to come in, you're going to see that after intense politicking, by July 2nd, all but one state had voted for independence. New York abstained from voting for independence. And again, New York was one of those colonies that was very reluctant to break away from the British Empire, a lot of that having to do with trade relationships with the British. But after a couple of days, New York voted to adopt it, and on July 1st, the entire Continental Congress has agreed to adopt this. Now, the Declaration of Independence, besides being, of course, this really powerful document about a new theory of government and social contract and the rights of man, also has a long list of indictments against the King of England. So again, the English very fond of these declarations, right? And so they are justifying in this document with these lists of indictments against the king the reasons why they feel the need for independence, right? So there are all of these indictments listed out. Now, there was a huge debate in the Continental Congress over whether or not to have one of those indictments accuse the king of the cruelness of the slave trade. And interestingly, Thomas Jefferson, although a slaveholder himself, wanted that grievance written in there against the king. And the Southern delegation refused to support the document with that grievance in it. So that grievance was actually removed from the original draft of the document. And that was one of the major edits that was done to the original draft. So it is adopted on July 4, 1776. And at that time, this changes sort of the nature and also the gravity of this particular conflict. So immediately, the Declaration has a major impact on this war, right? Not only does the Declaration then become the philosophical foundation for this new government, but it also is forcing the colonists to choose between loyalty to the English crown or independence. And and you're talking about a very serious choice, right? Because the British Empire is the most powerful empire on the planet at the time. So think to yourself, what would you do in this circumstance? Would you take up arms against the most powerful empire in the world, or would you, choose to side secretly maybe side with the king? So it was a major choice, and it immediately kind of bifurcated the colonists between the patriots and the loyalists. As I mentioned already when I talked about slaves in the American Revolution, this cry for liberty, this cry for equality that was written into the Declaration of Independence, this seemed, and it was, did not escape the minds of enslaved people in the American colonies, that this seemed extremely hypocritical, right? While, the enslaved remained enslaved. Many of them, 20,000, as I mentioned before, will ultimately go to fight with the British, and about half of those who fight for the British will eventually get their freedom after the American Revolution. The Declaration also becomes the basis for what are called freedom petitions by slaves after the Revolution, and we are going to talk about that when we talk about the post-revolutionary period. Okay, so here you see here an image of what probably a typical Continental soldier would have looked like in the Revolutionary War. So it was about a quarter of the adult white male population that ends up volunteering for this war effort. Initially, they were asked to volunteer for 1 year, but that turned out to be inadequate as it quickly became obvious to people that this conflict was going to extend much further. So they encouraged 3 year enlistments by offering new soldiers a $20 bonus, while men who committed for the duration of the war were promised post-war land grant of 100 acres. And that was really a powerful incentive, right? To be able to own 100 acres would give you not only the ability to probably make a living, but also it would give you the ability to have a political voice. Because again, keep in mind, in order to vote, you needed to own property. So this was a very powerful incentive. Women also served in the Continental Army. They served at what was called camp followers. They served by cooking for the army, washing the clothes, nursing the wounded. Close to 20,000 camp followers served during the war. Many of them were wives of men in service. Some 12,000 children also tagged along, and babies were born at the camp. So these were full-scale little cities, really, that were following the Revolutionary Army as they went across the countryside. Black Americans were at first excluded from the Continental Army, a rule that the slave owner George Washington made as commander in chief. But as the need for manpower increased and northern states began to welcome free blacks into service. So if you were free African American, you were able to serve. Even slaves could serve with their master's permission. But basically, at the end of the conflict, about 100,000 African American Black men served in the Revolutionary Army. That's far fewer than what was serving in the British Army, as I have already mentioned. Okay, so let's talk now about the British Army and their strategy. So they had it was not a very clear cut task for the British, right? They're at first really reluctant to, ravage the countryside, confiscate food, burn villages and towns. They wanted and needed a large land army and counted on the help of Americans who remained loyal to the king. So, their job really they saw was to curb this rebellion, to squash the rebellion, but not to completely destroy the colonies, right? But to restore the colonies. So their overall plan was to divide and conquer. And this was something that the British Empire did throughout the world when they went on their conquests. So the first thing that they did was they focused on New York. This was the state that was judged to be the harbor of the greatest number of loyalist subjects. So they wanted to make sure that they had New York secured. It would give them a good port for resupply. And it basically becomes the headquarters of the British Army throughout the Revolutionary War. The second approach was to isolate New England. So if you held New York, you could cut off the rest of New England, right? So all of the colonies north of New York could be isolated, especially Massachusetts. And so they're focusing at first on Massachusetts, New England, and isolating them and containing them and stopping the rebellion there. And then their secondary sort of goal was um, to conquer Virginia or to squash the rebellion in Virginia. So the two largest concentrations of patriots really existed in places like Massachusetts and Virginia. So those were their two focus. And again, also co-opting the help of the Americans who remained loyal to the British government. So, although your textbook, I don't think divides up the Revolutionary War like this is a way that I personally divide up the Revolutionary War. It's a way to kind of understand the different phases of the Revolutionary War. This was not like a modern war where there was just continual fighting and bombing and that type of thing. There were a lot of sustained breaks throughout this war. Typically, there was not fighting that was done during the winter. There are some exceptions to that, but in general, the armies would take a break during the winter and then they would resume fighting in the spring and summer. And so there are some kind of distinct phases. The first phase is what I just generically call the first year of the war. And this is where the Americans are going to suffer multiple defeats. There's going to be some setbacks, but that's going to change. And as we get into the second phase of the war, the campaigns of the North and the West, there's going to be some key victories for the Americans throughout the years 1777 to 1779. And then the final phase of the war, which is kind of the British Army's last attempt to subdue the rebellion in the colonies, and that's the Southern Campaign. And that's where the British really focus on going down to the Southern colonies and again trying to co-opt the people in those colonies that are loyal to the crown. And so that phase of the war will last from 1778 to 1781 to the end of the war. So that's how I divide it up in my mind. Hopefully that's useful to you. So let's get started here. Okay, So, we're going to talk now about the Battle of Long Island. So, up to this point, we have talked about a couple of battles. We've talked about Lexington and Concord, which, of course, is the beginning of the Revolutionary War. We talked about the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was technically an English victory. As far as casualty counts, the Americans had the advantage there, but the Americans were forced to retreat. And now we're going to talk about the Battle of Long Island, which was also an American defeat. So General Washington and General Howe are going to be the two major generals. General Washington, of course, for the Americans, General Howe for the British, that are going to battle at this battle in August of 1776. So basically, what it is you've got the Americans who have established an outpost on Manhattan, and then you have the British who are establishing an outpost on Long Island. And they also are creating a naval blockade on the Narrows, which is essentially the opening to the New York Harbor. It's the opening that leads to the Hudson River and the East River, right? So the British, from the very beginning had the advantage of an established navy. Washington, at the end of this battle, is going to be forced to retreat. His retreat will be pursued by the British, and there will be more fighting up the Hudson. And he will be forced to retreat again. This time he retreats south down to Pennsylvania, right across the Delaware River. So he's right at the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So when Howe does advance and attack, they'll take many American casualties with them. But more significantly is that the POWs that are taken, the prisoners of war, the American prisoners of war. The British essentially set up these prison ships in New York Harbor, which are ships that have been stripped of their sails. They're essentially permanently moored. And the Americans are taken and put into these ships where the conditions of their imprisonment were very, very poor. Keep in mind that when the British took American POWs, they saw them as traitors. Being a traitor, typically the punishment for any kind of treacherous act against a nation is the punishment is death, right? And so when the British did take prisoners, they had no problem treating these prisoners as if they had committed this capital crime, this very, very serious felony. So the next slide, I'm going to show a map. This is actually a battle map of the Battle of Long Island, and it is an animated map. So we're going to watch it actually move. We're going to see the different movements of the troops at this Battle of Long Island. So here you see the British advancement. One of the coolest things about this map, and I was so happy when I found it, is that you can look up here. This battle took place on August 27th, 1776, and you could actually see the time lapse as the battle takes place. So you see here the battle begins actually at 8 p.m. The British are trying to outflank the Americans. The Americans are represented here in blue. The British are represented by the red, and then the Hessian soldiers are the German mercenaries who are fighting for the British. Mercenary soldiers are soldiers that fight for a fee. They're like professional soldiers. And the British Army used quite a few German mercenaries known as the Hessians in the Revolutionary War. So this is the area I was talking about in the last slide. This is known as the Narrows. This is how you get into New York Bay and how you get to the East River and the Hudson River. The British had basically blocked this off for the Americans. And so they had their encampments here on Long Island. This is Manhattan. This is the outpost for George Washington and his army at the time. Obviously, they're outflanked, they're outnumbered, they're outgunned. And by the time the battle is over, the Americans are forced to cross back over onto Manhattan, retreat up Manhattan Island, eventually crossing over into New Jersey. But isn't this cool? Okay, so there we go. And you can see here, yeah. So it's essentially it's over a 12-hour long battle. So it was pretty intense. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to look at a different map, and this is going to kind of show us the long retreat of Washington's army after the Battle of Long Island. So here you have the Battle of Long Island, the one that we just looked at on that animated map. And then you see the retreat of Washington's army. So Washington is forced to retreat. He's going up Manhattan, where he eventually is going to come over here to up all the way up to White Plains, what is now White Plains, New York, where there will be another battle. He's forced to retreat again. So you have General Howe and Cornwallis, who are both pursuing Washington's army. Again, more battles. He just continues to retreat, until eventually he's retreated all the way down into across the Delaware River over into Pennsylvania. And that's where we're going to pick up on the next battle. So this was a very humiliating retreat, right, for Washington. He's literally being chased out of New York, out of New Jersey, and forced to retreat down into Pennsylvania. Okay, so Washington's army is really at a low point at this point in time. And not only that, it's winter has set in. It's December of 1776, and Washington has a decision to make. Is he going to hunker his army down for the winter, or is he going to carry out a surprise attack against the British? And he decides to carry out this surprise attack. Now, as I said, he is camped over in Pennsylvania, which is across the Delaware River from a British holdout in New Jersey, in Trenton, New Jersey. And so Washington, like I said, decides that he is going to carry out the surprise attack. He very famously crosses the Delaware River, which is actually iced over. This is, of course, an artist rendering of that crossing. And they are going to attack the Hessian soldiers that are stationed in Trenton, New Jersey, and they're going to carry out this attack on Christmas Day. It is. I put up a video in the instructor video optional resources on your Canvas page in the module. These are optional videos, but there is a video in there on this particular attack. It's called "The 10 Days That Changed the World," and the reason why it's titled that is because this advancement of Washington's army, as unusual as it was for the time period to advance an army in the middle of winter, was extremely bold. But without it, it's questionable as to whether or not Washington's army would have uh, maintained throughout the winter, because the morale was so low. And there was a very high desertion rate. Soldiers were leaving, they were going back home. And so this victory for the Americans, for the Continental Army, really will boost morale. And then, Washington will not just stop at the Battle of Trenton. He goes on to carry out another battle in Princeton, New Jersey, which will also be a success for the Continental Army. So this was a very bold but very decisive and important move in Washington, and it does represent one of those points in the American Revolution where it was kind of a make it or break it moment, right? Where either the cause was going to go on or it was going to be defeated. And as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Thomas Paine, one of the things that Washington does before he gets his troops to cross the Delaware is he reads a tract from the American Crisis, one of the articles written by Thomas Paine that talks about the importance of endurance and keeping on with the cause. So there is the British outpost in Trenton. As I said, this is a huge victory for the Americans. And there you see a battle map. This is the American advancement down into Trenton, and then eventually they will move on to Princeton. You see here the Delaware River. Okay, so here is an artist's rendering of the Hessian soldiers, who I keep referring to. These were German mercenaries. About 30,000 of them will fight for the British in the Revolutionary War. They're very distinctive with their cone hats and their distinctive uniforms that they wore during the war. Okay, so as I mentioned about the Declaration of Independence, it's really going to bifurcate or create two different groups of colonists after it is written. You're going to have, on the one hand, the loyalists, the people who are remaining loyal to the British crown, who don't want to break away from the British Empire. They're fine being English colonists, right? And then on the other hand, you have the patriots, and the patriots are the ones that are volunteering for the armies. They feel very strong and passionate about the cause of independence, right? So the numbers for the loyalists are kind of unclear because it became very dangerous in the American colonies to be a loyalist. You could get imprisoned, you could have your land confiscated. So a lot of people secretly remained loyal to the crown, but you've got about 1/5 or 20%, if you prefer, of the colonists that remained loyal to the crown. Okay. You've got about 2/5, right, or 40% who really didn't care, right? So if you put those two numbers together, that means that there are 60% of the colonists that either didn't care one way or another, kind of felt like meh about, whether or not, to break away, or, didn't really feel impassioned about the movement for independence. And then, you've got 20% that are, really very strongly loyal to the crown. So that means that only 40%, which obviously is a minority, were the ones that felt very strongly about this Revolutionary War effort. And so it makes the Revolutionary War, in some ways, even more remarkable that you had this very dedicated, impassioned minority that were really, pushing forward this cause. Um, a lot of the people in the colonies were turned off by the Patriot cause because the Patriots, some of them were seen as being very violent. Remember the tarring and feathering and the hanging of effigies and the attacks and the whatever. And then, and also some people saw the Patriots as being power hungry themselves, as wanting to, kick out the British Empire so that they themselves could have political power. The majority of the Indian tribes, because keep in mind, of course, they're there too, are going to side with the British. And this is because, remember the Royal Line of Proclamation of 1763? So you've got this line of proclamation that had allowed for the Native Americans to have this reservation, essentially, or this native territory, and the British were willing to uphold that line. The native people were much more afraid of the American colonists, who obviously had an interest in taking that land. So they were supportive of the British because they wanted to um, keep that line intact, and they wanted to stop those settlers from encroaching on their land. It didn't take very long for the Second Continental Congress to declare all loyalists as traitors. And in June of 1775, and after June of 1775, it became very dangerous, as I mentioned, to openly declare your support for the British Empire. During the war, about 7,000 to 8,000 loyalists will leave the colonies for England, and about 28,000 more will go to Canada, because remember, this time Canada is British. Okay, so here is the final slide for this PowerPoint, and it's a map. And what this map shows us is the areas of the colonies where there were loyalists, a strong concentration of loyalists, where you have native people, obvious, who are either loyalist or neutral. You have areas, so the loyalist strongholds are shown here in orange. So New York, of course, was a hugely loyalist area. You also have some big areas down here in the South. And then the Indian territories, again, either loyalist or neutral. The strongly contested areas, which are shown here in yellow, these were areas where there was almost like an equal amount of people who were loyal and people who were, patriots. And then you have the patriot strongholds reflected there in blue. So even though you see here that the majority of the territory is blue, keep in mind that a lot of these blue areas are very sparsely populated. So if we look at the population concentration centers, which are essentially here along the coast, you can see that there's still a lot of people who remained either loyal or neutral to the cause. All right, that's it for now, and I will see you on Revolutionary War, Chapter 5, Part 3.